We're back for round 2, having looked at Cyberpunk on PS4 and Pro, a game with serious performance issues on each. It's finally time to see the situation on base Xbox One and One X. Just what's the score with Xbox One as the weakest console of the last generation? Does it run the game well, or at least well enough to enjoy? And then we have the far more powerful One X console, a machine that renders Cyberpunk's world at a far higher resolution, but are frame rates holding up compared to the PS4 consoles? To answer all this and more, I'm teaming up with DF's head honcho, Richard Ledbetter. How's it going?
Yeah, not bad, Tom. So this has all been like a game of two halves so far, really. A bit of a disappointing showing on the last gen consoles, but big improvements on the next gen versions. But well, actually, while we're here, something's bothering me about the last Cyberpunk video, so I guess now's as good a time as any to clear all of this up. So I mentioned there that Xbox consoles had more features and thought that might be related to the Xbox One marketing deal for the bespoke Cyberpunk console that came out a while back. Turns out, of course, that as we shall see in this video, the new features I was talking about there are only available on Series consoles, not One X. So obviously it's nothing to do with the One X marketing deal. So in terms of why Series consoles have features that PlayStation 5 does not, that's still unknown, but the smart money is on the fact that Microsoft opens up access to next-gen horsepower on last-gen code with a degree of flexibility we've not seen on PlayStation 5 so far. So, yeah, to be clear, yes, there was a Cyberpunk marketing deal with Microsoft, but it was for the One X console, and that's it. My mistake, and since a lot of people have picked up on that comment and run with it in all manner of different directions, I've got to apologise for that. But anyway, I really hope that clarifies things and, well, hopefully sets the record straight. And, of course, we're going to get to the actual Xbox One X feature set in this video. So, well, let's crack on, right?
Right. I think the big question here right away is we know the base PS4 was already pretty low on the resolution side at dynamic 900p. So the thinking is, how much lower can base Xbox One go? Usually it's a sort of a level down. So to jump right into that, the resolution is 1440 by 810 at max, but it goes down to 1280 by 720 and possibly lower as well. I've seen pixel counts come in at 1200 by 675p. So that's during the sort of alley shootout that we've kind of standardized as a test. But yeah, it's very hard to count this game, but numbers do come up regularly just below 720p as well. So yeah, it really does show up.
Yeah, it's kind of super grainy, really. And this is a game that's based a lot on kind of temporal reprojection using information from prior frames. And I think there's like a compound effect here, because if the prior frames are a lower resolution and your current frame is a lower resolution, then it kind of doesn't look particularly great. And, well, I think the presentation speaks for itself here. I mean, we went in expecting the worst, I guess, out of all of the consoles, because fundamentally it is the weakest machine and we are getting the poorest visual turnout here. Yeah, I don't think that's particularly a surprise. But on the flip side, we have Xbox One X, which is the most powerful console of the last generation.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated to see what you came up with there.
It was a much higher pixel count than I'd actually imagined. Bearing in mind Pro was, around 1188p highest. This one, One X, comes in at 2976 by 1674. That's 1674p. That's the maximum I've found just looking up at the sky. But then it goes down, when you go into the city, and it's still very respectable, I've got to say. I didn't expect it to stay above 1080p necessarily, but it sticks out at literally the PS4 Pro's max resolution, which is 2112 by 1188.
So PS4 Pro's maximum resolution is Xbox One X's minimum resolution. That's kind of fascinating, bearing in mind the teraflops differential. I'm kind of suspecting that memory might have a part to play in this. Obviously, the One X has got 4 gigs more memory to play with, which I guess is being utilized here.
Yeah, very true. And also, not to skip too far ahead, but it does seem to affect possibly the frame rate as well. Yeah, it does pay a price for that. But we'll get to that later.
Right, so just to confirm then, the game on Xbox One X doesn't have quality and performance modes as it does on Series X, right?
No, it doesn't.
Right, so it's just this one mode. That's really interesting because we kind of suspected or assumed wrongly that being a backwards compatibility port on Series X, that it would be, leveraging One X features, but it looks like it's a little bit more bespoke than we imagined. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it seems like everything between the One X and Series X is a bit more of a fluid approach for developers to add their own bits and pieces to the code. But yeah, no mode selection here. And it makes sense, bearing in mind I don't think much of a way this could have hit 60 FPS.
Right, yeah. Well, I guess we'll come on to that. But if we're looking at the two Xbox machines, are we fundamentally looking at the same visual feature set beyond resolution, or is there anything else to separate them?
So going into this, I really thought, how much can you cut out of Cyberpunk before it stops being Cyberpunk? And obviously, there's no question, you can see the footage, Xbox One is dropping frames quite seriously. So the goal there clearly was to prune back settings where possible, but I don't think there's been a heck of a lot drawn back, honestly. Shadow resolution is definitely pruned back. There's a lower quality preset, blurrier, shadow outlines, coarser on the outliner when we do this close-up of the character. Shadow draw distance on Xbox One is low quality as well. Shadows literally sort of draw in closer to the camera. So the shadow side is pared back, but then there's stuff like occasional textures as well, which again appear low grade on the base machine. So it actually mirrors what the base PS4 and Pro had in terms of the differences there. When we look down at this floor texture, it's just a lower resolution asset on the newspaper as well and the floor. So shadows, textures, those are pared back. And I've also noticed in the nighttime set piece where you're kind of in a car chase, there's a perfectly matched shot where you're looking through the front of the car. You can see a lot of the volumetric buffers on the lights are low quality. You can see kind of light pooling into spots rather than evenly distributed across the light. Perhaps it's linked to the internal native resolution.
Yeah, this would tie in with what Alex was saying on his PC video, where it does seem that some of the post-processing effects are directly associated with resolution. So the lower the resolution, the less precise the effect, and I guess we're seeing that playing out here.
Yeah, definitely. One more thing, pop-in as well. I've got to say it, it's really, really severe on Xbox One, the base machine. You can walk up to your car for the first time and you'll just see it as this very low quality rendition, sort of the far distance LOD that you'd expect, but you're right up against it, and it takes a few seconds to switch over to the near field one. And then there's problems with NPCs as well, which I'm sure there's been a lot of reports on Twitter about this, but yeah, you'll see people kind of in a half-rendered state. It's not a good look, and it's mainly on base Xbox One.
Right, okay. So let's move on and take a look at Xbox One X versus PS4 Pro. Kind of curious to see this one, because when we looked at Series X versus PS5, Series X had several improvements. So I'm wondering if those improvements are backported to Xbox One X or not.
From what I'm taking from this, it's a no. The Series X looks like it's being kind of uniquely sculpted. From what I can see in like these street runs, most cutscenes, the feature set is absolutely identical. It's just the resolution push that One X benefits from, which makes our life very easy, just like putting this side by side. There's not a heck of a lot between them, and yeah, I suppose the resolution bump in itself is enough. Like, that's quite a significant jump. But yeah, shadow quality, textures, the rest of it, even pop-in, exactly the same.
Okay, well, we've got to move on to performance, because this is fundamentally the big reason that we're having issues with the base consoles in particular. Bearing in mind, Xbox One is the weakest of the last generation consoles. I'm kind of not expecting particularly good turnout here based on what we saw with the base PlayStation 4, which was also abysmal in many places.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? I booted up the save you sent over when you started the game first. I jumped into my first 5 minutes on base Xbox One, bating my breath a little bit, thinking this could be bad. I'm not sure entirely. Let's just see how it goes. Fingers crossed. I did that test where we drive around the corner from the main city square, right down to the infamous alley where we get into that shootout, where we saw sort of drops to 15 FPS on base PS4. This time it's just significantly worse. And in fact, within 5 minutes, I bumped into a full-on hang-up in terms of the renderer. It absolutely hung up for a good minute before I could even begin to play again.
Sorry, a minute?
Yep, a minute. I mean, I'll put a time code on this just to show it off, but yeah, had to wait there, just going in and out of the Xbox menus, just kind of thinking, is this crashed? Is it going to come back to life? And eventually it did, and then it started dropping to about the low tens, basically. The outlook already was not great, and then I thought, all right, I'll go through the game myself from the beginning. Let's hit all the points that we hit with our PS4 and Pro videos. So the first battle on your first mission with Jackie, usually this runs at about 30 FPS, some drops under, but for the first time on console, this is actually just near the 20s, It's not good enough, nowhere near.
Well, I'll tell you what, I played the Nomad role, which I don't think you did, and there's an area in there just before you enter the city where you're in a garage with Jackie. So a very, very, very confined area. You're basically looking at some contraband in the trunk, and tightly confined area, that was dropping beneath 30 frames per second. So yeah, there's a lot of issues here on the base Xbox One. Looking at your data, it's even worse than I imagined it would be. But man, this is not a good look.
No, obviously the driving shootout set piece runs pretty abysmally, just as with the base PS4. Yeah, the worst parts really are anything in the street, anything to do with driving, and it's easily the worst of the four. There's no other way to dress it up. We could see this coming in a way, relative to the other consoles, but it's still kind of sobering to see. And even looking at like later missions, you go to the All Foods headquarters. Most of this usually ran at, 25 to 30, and now it's like 20 to 25 on base Xbox One. And again, going to the nightclub area, it's just not good enough, frankly.
Right, yeah. I mean, I'm disappointed because fundamentally the base Xbox One does have a faster CPU than the base PlayStation 4. So I was expecting there to be some mitigating factor that might draw back Xbox One into contention, but clearly that isn't the case here. But let's move on because, obviously Xbox One is the worst performing machine of the last generation, and Xbox One X is the best. So what do we got there?
Right, so let's kick off with that first shootout on the first mission with Jackie. It is 30 FPS, thankfully, but I did notice, and this is a sign of what we're going to tee up a bit later, but the performance is lower than PS4 Pro. I think that's the bottom line for this version is it's better than the base consoles, but it's worse than Pro. Sometimes by a hair, sometimes by a considerable margin.
Right.
I think that margin increases the more you get into these big city areas. Frankly, it's just way below what I expected. The driving shootout section is just much worse. You can see it here. It's dipping into the mid-20s. Yeah, anything to do with driving, as soon as you hit that car, hit the road, it goes to the 20 FPS line. It's just way below what I expected. And, I'm sure you, like me, thought this console might have had a fairly good chance at delivering something, at least a tighter lock than the Pro version, but it's not there. 30 FPS in indoor sections at least, but...
Yeah, I mean, across the generation, we've seen that Xbox One X is generally the most powerful machine of that era. And there have been occasions at some point where you kind of think maybe they favoured resolution over performance and the Pro would be faster. What I'd say in this case is that you have got a very wide DRS window to begin with. Maybe it could be wider, but the stuff that you're showing here, like the driving, typically that is where we're CPU limited. I mean, we kind of know that because we've seen it on PC. That's the same sort of impact. So I still can't quite get my head around why the Xbox One X, which is the most powerful of the last gen machines, yes, you're getting a much higher pixel count, but it seems like where we're CPU limited, it's performing lower than PlayStation 4 Pro, which actually has a slightly slower CPU. So yeah, but overall, I think your takeaway from the base PS4 versus Pro video was that it's not acceptable on the base machine and just about gets there on the Pro. So is it the same situation here, or?
If we go to the comparisons between Pro and X, yeah, it's a clear-cut advantage, and that means if you can see this as acceptable just from the results, we said it in our last video, but last generation, we enjoyed GTA 5 at 25 FPS, and it was, it's not ideal, obviously, but it's all relative, to as it was for PS3.
Yeah, I just don't know where they're going to go from here. Stuff like the minute-long lockup,
yep.
I do expect that can be fixed. But fundamentally, everything that we're seeing here just suggests that CD Projekt Red have hit fundamental limitations that are associated with the last-gen consoles. Because, you look at Series S, it's got a less capable GPU judged in terms of teraflops than Xbox One X. It is running at a lower resolution, but it's producing a far more consistent, far more enjoyable experience. It's a really nice little machine, actually, for playing Cyberpunk. So I really just hope they can do something here, but I'm really not sure what they can do. based on the scale of the challenge here?
I think the real clanger for me is that it's crashing as well as hitching, sort of locking up. I've had this in about a span of 1 hour, 2 hours on 1X. Alone, I had 8 points where sort of the screen locks up. And it can go one of two ways. It can either resume play after about 5-10 seconds, which it did for 6 of those 8. But then there were 2 times where it just crashed to the system menus. There's a hotfix patch. It's 1.04. It says in the patch notes that it's fixing a lot of these issues, along with the epilepsy issue as well.
Right. It doesn't actually say that we're going to get improved performance, though. And that's borne out by the results here, isn't it?
Yeah, so I dipped back into the base Xbox One just to see 1.04, and it's the same deal. You know, I think really there's only so far you can pull this one back up. I don't believe it's going to hit 30 in a lot of these sections. So yeah, it's pretty hard to recommend right now. But with that said, CDPR did release a kind of note to the people who bought the base PS4 and Xbox One versions, saying they're on the case for next year to release full-on patches in January, February, to hopefully address a lot of these lingering issues. The performance side definitely needs addressing. So they're on the case, and we'll just have to see what comes up. And of course, as ever, we'll be covering those as and when they land. But for now, yeah, it's very hard to recommend base Xbox One, especially in the state it's in.
I think in the here and now, next-gen consoles produce a pretty decent experience. I played Series S and I found that a really decent, I mean, not high resolution, there are issues there, but it's a really consistent experience. Series X, you've got the choice between 30 frames per second and 60 at 30. It's pretty much the best-looking console version of the game available. PS5, pretty much locked 60 apart from the driving and some minor fluctuations elsewhere. So there are options. Oh, and one thing I want to point out, probably do a video on this, but the Stadia version actually turned out pretty good. I was playing a bit of that yesterday. But, you know, last-gen consoles are really struggling here, and it's really difficult to recommend buying the game if you're definitely going to be playing on one of those systems.
The conclusion really is, sadly, it's not good news for Xbox One users. Hopefully some patches down the line will fix some of these issues at least. But for now, that's all we've got. Thanks so much, Rich, for joining me on this one.
No problem at all.
And let's do our outro here. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe. And don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. And to get in touch with all of us, just use Twitter as usual. But from Rich and myself, thanks for watching.